Hello and welcome, everybody. Today, I am joined by an incredible colleague of mine, attorney Cristina Casabianca. Cristina is an exceptional attorney. We've worked together on many E2 cases and other cases as well, but one of the case types that she is very knowledgeable on is the E2 visa. And in today's video, we're going to be talking all about the E2 visa. We're going to go through general overview of what the E2 visa is all about. We're going to go through tips when applying for your E2 visa. We're going to go through different observations about consulates that have particular challenges and consulates that tend to be a little bit more straightforward. We aim to provide some very beneficial value in today's video. And without further ado, welcome, Cristina. So happy to have you here.
Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. Yes, we've been working in a lot of E2 visas together, and it's a pleasure being here and being able to talk a little bit about the E2 visa.
Awesome. So with that, why don't you provide us with just a high-level overview of the E2 visa? You can share a little bit about how the visa works, what it's all about, and anything else you'd like to add.
Perfect. Yes, of course. So the E2 visa is an investor visa, non-immigrant visa, available to citizens of countries that have a treaty with the United States who want to enter the United States to make a substantial investment in a U.S. enterprise. The E2 visa has several requirements and components, and we're going to go through them. The number one being nationality. So, as mentioned earlier, this visa is available to citizens of countries that have a treaty with the United States. I believe currently there are more than 80 countries that have a treaty with the United States and whose citizens are eligible to apply. You don't necessarily need to be born in one of those treaty countries. As long as you're a citizen and have a valid passport, you're able to apply. Another important aspect about the E2 visa is that you need to show ownership and control. You have to show as an investor that you own at least 50% or more of the US enterprise. If the company is owned 50% or more by treaty nationals and no one person holds 150%, but together citizens of the same country own 15% or more, these people can consider coming as E2 employees instead of principal investors. But the important aspect here is that we need to show that citizens of a treaty country or the individual investor owns at least 50% or more of the US enterprise. So moving on to very important aspect about the E2 visa is the investment requirement. As mentioned earlier, the applicant must make a substantial investment in a bona fide enterprise in the United States. The investment must be sufficient to ensure the successful operation of the business. So there are multiple pieces to the investment requirement. You need to show that you have possession and control of the funds needed for the investment. You need to show as an investor that you have acquired the funds through lawful sources, such as personal savings, employment income, a gift, an inheritance, earnings. And the idea is to show that the funds come from a legitimate source and not for any criminal activity. The funds don't necessarily need to come from outside the United States. You can have the funds here, and as long as you show where the origin or where the source comes from, you can use these funds that are in your possession to invest in a U.S. enterprise. What type of evidence do we include for source of funds? It depends on each case, but usually tax returns from the principal investor or for the person who gifted you the funds. As mentioned earlier, you can use gifts as part of the investment. And you also need to show if the funds come from a gift, where that person obtained the funds for the investment. So tax returns, employment letters, if you sold property, any sale and purchase agreement, and showing how the funds come into your bank accounts showing transfers, all these documents will suffice to show the source of funds. Loans are accepted as long as they're not secured with the assets of the business. So keep that in mind because that's very important. Another important requirement that encompasses the investment requirement is that the funds must be at risk. So this means that you cannot just transfer funds to the bank account of your enterprises and say, listen, I had this amount of money and now I transfer it to the bank account of the business. I made an investment. No, you need to show that you have spent the money for the startup operations and expenses needed for the business to become operational. So typical expenditures for a startup include inventory, equipment, website, marketing, office supplies, any rent. So all these expenditures are good for a company that is a startup. So you will need the bank account of the business showing how you spend all these funds and that how you spend the funds are what is needed to make this business operational. If you're buying or purchasing an existing business, you need to show that you paid the total purchase price of the business. The good thing that you can use to mitigate your financial loss is escrow. You can place the money in an escrow account and sign an escrow agreement and the sale agreement for the purchase of the business, but the escrow will have a contingency. The only contingency left in the escrow would be for the funds to be transferred to the seller upon the approval of the E2 visa. So if the visa gets approved, the funds will leave escrow, will be transferred directly to the seller. If the E2 visa gets denied, the funds will leave escrow and be returned to the investor. So moving on to the substantial requirement. As mentioned earlier, you need to make a substantial investment in the U.S. enterprise. There's no minimum set dollar amount anywhere in the regulations. What is substantial is going to depend on the type of business you're investing in. For example, if it's a consulting company, generally it has much lower costs than if you're going to open a restaurant. So it just really depends on the type of business you're investing. So even though there's no dollar amount required under the regulations for an investment for an E2 visa, we generally tell our clients that an investment of around 100K is the lowest investment that we would recommend, just because consular officers are used to consider these amounts to be substantial. So again, the important aspect here is to ensure that you have spent the majority of the funds to make a business operational, to the point where you can show that your business is going to be operating. So when we look at substantiality, we also look at the proportionality test. What does it mean? That the money that you have investment is proportional to what it usually costs to establish that type of business that you're investing. So that's the important test you should keep in mind. If you're buying an existing business, then you will need to show what is substantial is going to be considered the purchase price if it's purchased in the open market. What do we do for purchasing businesses? We need to make sure that it makes sense. So we look at the business's tax returns and financial to ensure that what you're actually investment makes sense in light of the business that you're purchasing. So moving on to another important requirement of the E2 visa will be it's that the business must be real and operational. So you need to show that it's an active investment and that your business produces goods or services for profit. So it cannot be a passive investment. And the business requires you to have an active supervisor executive oversight. So any passive investment won't be sufficient for an E2 visa. Again, you need to show that it's active and for profit. So when you're purchasing an existing business, what types of documents do we look for? We would like to see the company's tax returns. We would like to see the company's financials. We would like to see W-2s, payroll records, everything that shows that the business is real and operating. If you are having a startup, we can show that the business is operational, or we can show that the business is at the brink of operation, meaning that you have spent all the funds necessary to have the business ready upon the approval of your visa. So why would you need to show your consular officer? You will need to show that you already secured premises, so that you paid rent, that you have all the permits in place, that everything's ready for when the officer approves your visa, that you can come and open the doors of your business. So it doesn't really need to be operational at the time we apply for your visa, but it has to be set up to that point. What documents do we use to show startup? Again, we use a lease agreement showing that you already started a lease. We show pictures to show that everything's set up. It also depends on the type of business, but if it's a retail business, then we show the store, we show the pictures, everything in place. If it's, consulting services, well, you just need office space and computers. Whatever it is that you're investing, you just need to show the consular officer that is in place. So permits and everything else. Another important requirement about the E2 visa is marginality. You need to show the officer that your business must have the present or future capacity to generate more than enough income to provide a minimum living for you and your family. To be considered non-marginal, a business must demonstrate that it is profitable, self-sustaining, and capable of contributing to the U.S. economy. Some ways you can show that your business is not marginal is by having a business plan that shows expansion of local job opportunities, positive impact to the local economy, have the potential to grow over the next few years, and remain profitable for a set amount of time. Another requirement of the E2 visa involves showing that you can solely direct and develop the enterprise. This means owning at least 50% of the company and actively participating in the management of its operations. Demonstrating prior business or industry experience can be beneficial. Activities under this category include managing personnel, managing business operations, finances, and marketing efforts. Passive investments as explained before, do not qualify for an E2 visa. This is a non-immigrant visa. So what this means is that you must have that intent to go back to your home country after you finalize your investment and you manage your business and the business has become operational. It just means that you have to have an intention at the time of the application to go back to your home country. This is not a very high standard. Usually with a statement with intention to depart is sufficient to show your intention to go back. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go back to your home country after the 5 years of your visa or after your visa expired. It just means that you have that intention, you can continue to have a foreign residency, and you can renew your visa as long as the business still needs you here to direct, to develop, and to hire employees, supervisor employees. So you can continue to renew this visa as long as all the eligibility requirements are in place and your business has been operating.
Fantastic answer. Thank you so much, Cristina. See, I promised that we would deliver some value, and so far I can say with confidence that we're holding up our end of the bargain. So thank you for that outstanding answer. So much there, but just a couple points that I wanted to mention. Just to highlight, one of the benefits of the E2, as Cristina was mentioning, is that your dependents can also accompany you on the case, your spouse and your unmarried children under 21 years old, and your spouse gets work authorization. And not only does your spouse get work authorization, but your spouse gets work authorization to work for any company. As the E2 principal investor, you're authorized to direct and develop your E2 company, but your spouse can actually go and seek employment with any US company. So their work authorization is actually more broad than the principal E2 applicant, which is a tremendous benefit. One more thing, Cristina did an excellent job going through the requirements, and there's so much detail to each of those requirements. So I do want to emphasize that if you're watching this video, just know that we're of course doing our best to convey a whole lot of information, but of course, anytime you want to take any sort of action, you want to make sure to consult with a qualified immigration lawyer before you take that action, because it's very possible that something that you heard, you could have potentially misinterpreted, or it's impossible to provide blanket statements that apply to every potential scenario. So it's just very important to always consult with an attorney before taking any sort of action. I just wanted to specify that point. One more thing, we talked about proportionality in the context of an E2 visa. Proportionality is its own beast and animal of a concept to talk about. I've recorded another video on our channel that goes through the specific regulations on when you're making an E2 investment, what is considered proportional. And I encourage everybody to go check that out. I may actually end up linking to that video in the description of this video. And I do want to ask you, now that we've gone through such a high-level, detailed overview of the E2, we've talked about the requirements, some of the benefits, and how this whole thing works. I wanted to ask you, what is your opinion on who the ideal candidate is for an E2 visa? Maybe what characteristics does this individual have, or however you want to interpret that, who is the ideal candidate for this visa category?
Thank you, Michael. So I think for me, an ideal candidate for an E2 visa would be someone obviously that is a citizen of one of the treaty countries, someone that has enough funds and the financial capability of making a substantial investment in the US, someone who possesses relevant business experience, someone that has a clear, viable business plan with job creation and positive economic impact. And I guess lastly, someone that has the intention to genuinely come and direct and develop this business.
Great answer. This isn't for somebody that's just looking to buy a house and rent a house out. This isn't for somebody that wants to passively invest in a piece of real estate. It's really designed for somebody to come to the United States and direct and develop the business. So of course, as Cristina mentioned, you need to be from a treaty country. You need to have funds to invest in this business. The funds do not have to be funds that you've earned through employment. You maybe can sell a property and use those funds to invest, or you may potentially get a gift from a friend or a family member. But you do ultimately need to have the funds one way or the other to commit to this business so that you can demonstrate that you've made a substantial investment. And of course, you have to be willing to direct and develop a business in the United States. So great answer, Cristina. Now, one of the questions that we often get asked, particularly from our clients that don't necessarily know what type of business they want to do, is they want to know what business is best for an E2 visa. What businesses would you consider to be well suited for the E2 visa?
Generally, I think good E2 visa investments or companies would be where you can show high startup costs or a high purchase price just to meet the substantial investment requirements. Those businesses that are active, not passive investments. And those businesses that are able to provide a minimum living for the treaty investor and his family and create jobs. That being said, some examples would be franchises. They're generally considered a good E2 visa investments because they offer a well-established business model. Retail businesses, as long as you can show that you're going to hire employees, they usually have high startup costs in inventory, in lease and everything. So those are always good E2 businesses. Businesses in the hospitality industry, restaurants, hotels, bed and breakfasts. Those are also good E2 businesses. Manufacturing businesses, again, high startup costs, potential for job creation. And consulting businesses, even though generally consulting businesses might not have higher investments, as long as you can show positive economic impact and that you're going to create jobs, I think that those are also well suited for an E2.
So some characteristics have been, like you mentioned, businesses with high startup costs makes it much easier to demonstrate that you have made a substantial investment, makes it easier to figure out how to invest your money when you're entering a business model that does require you to actually invest. Sometimes businesses will have lower startup costs and it poses a challenge, and we'll get into that, I'm sure. But conversely, what would you say are the business types that typically have more issues?
So I would say typically businesses that are marginal businesses that are not able to show that you're going to create jobs and that they won't provide a minimal living for the treaty investor and his family, that won't have a positive economic impact. Those businesses tend to have problems. I think home-based businesses might face challenges as well. I think it's important to separate the primary residence from a business space is essential. So home-based businesses might have problems as well. Any investment concerns where you didn't make all the investment that was required to bring the business operational, to show that everything you invested was necessary to establish this business. Businesses that are temporary in nature, so any seasonal businesses just that don't have an ongoing active operations, so just seasonal, those can also have issues.
Again, I want to highlight that one of the challenges that I encounter is service-based businesses that have a very low startup cost. So here are two examples. In one example, you have a nail salon. Somebody that's considering investing in a business for an E2 visa and is considering a nail salon, they have to go out and lease a premises. They have to build out that premises with the massage chairs and all the equipment that's needed. And they will have to develop a website and undergo various marketing efforts, get insurance for the premises, and there are a lot of costs that go into establishing that business. Now, contrast that with somebody that plans to open up a tutoring business where they're going to be tutoring children in their schooling, like a mobile tutoring business, that they go to the student's house to tutor them, or they go to like a cafe and meet them to tutor them in their schooling. That business model would face several challenges, but one of them that I want to highlight is that it would be so challenging just to invest enough money for immigration to consider it that you made a substantial investment. And even if you did manage to find a way to make that investment, you're also facing an uphill battle with the marginality, with overcoming that presumption that it's a small business. So again, one of the very important parts of the E2 visa is deciding on what kind of business to invest in. And there's a lot of factors to consider, but picking a business that's going to have more of a straightforward path to making the investment and satisfying the requirements is ultimately going to relieve a lot of headache throughout this process. And with that, I wanted to ask you, what are some reasons that you've seen E2 investors have their cases denied? Or what are some grounds that you've seen for people getting their cases denied?
I have to say that you provided an excellent answer before, and it goes into this question too. I think visas do get denied when there's insufficient investment amount, and the contract was great. So businesses that have high costs and you can show that you're going to hire employees tend to be a straightforward path for an E2 visa. When you have a consulting business or services business, then this could be harder to show. And so if you don't have a sufficient investment amount, your visa can get denied. So That's one of the reasons I see visas getting denied. Businesses that don't show that they're operating or at the brink of operations, that you've invested some funds but still are under construction, or you haven't really finalized all the details to have secure permits and everything. So you cannot show the consular officer that this is going to be a viable business or that is operating or at the brink of operations. Business plans, if you don't have a clear business plan showing all the financial projections and feasibility, this can also be a cause for denial. Source of funds issues. I'm very meticulous about presenting a case where we clearly show where the origin of the funds. It's not as strict as other types of immigration cases, but you still need to convince the consular officer or your CIS officer how you obtain the funds and that these funds don't derive from any illegitimate source. So source of funds, if you don't have a clear path and you cannot be able to explain, that can also cause a denial. Lack of ownership and control. If you are not able to show that the U.S. enterprise is owned 50% by an individual investor or 50% or more foreign nationals holding the same treaty country nationality, those can be denied as well. Well, and overall inadequate documentation. Like if you don't provide all the information and all the requirements of the E2 visa, consulates are going to be strict and they're going to deny your case.
So somebody wants to apply for their E2 visa. What are your biggest tips for them? What is your advice to them to help them have a successful outcome?
Great. So obviously, always consult an immigration attorney. Make sure that you're well advised so that you know all the requirements for the E2 visa. But I think knowing your consulate is very important, and looking into the specific requirements for each consulate would be the number one requirement in my case. Always looking to what they ask, how they want the documentation presented. That's very important. Case can get denied or delayed if you don't comply with everything as they want the case to be. Again, going the same that what we discussed earlier, showing a substantial investment, having a business where you can show that it has high startup costs, that it's going to create jobs, or if you're buying an existing business that you paid the total purchase price and that it made sense in light of the type of business and its financials. That's also very important. Have a solid business plan. Have someone help you draft the business plan so that you can show what the consular officer, what your intention is for this type of business. Show that you're going to be actively involved. Explain what your functions are going to be in this business. Those are also very important aspects of the E2 business. And I think always maintain lawful status throughout the application process. If you're here in the United States, setting up your business, that's also a very important tip.
Great. You actually alluded to something that's very interesting. You talked about making sure to know the specific requirements of the consulate that you're applying at. So when you're applying for an E2 visa, there's two ways to go about it. One is if you're lawfully present in the United States in some sort of valid non-immigrant status, then you can do something called a change of status, which is where you change from one status that you're in the United States. For example, let's say you're in the United States as a student on an F1 visa, you could potentially change your status from within the United States to get E2 status. And when you do that, that's done through USCIS. But the other way is to actually apply for your E2 visa. And when you apply for an E2 visa, you do that directly at a consulate outside of the United States. Typically, you do it at your home consulate. So if you're Canadian, you would apply for your E2 visa at the consulate in Toronto. And the various countries that you apply at, interestingly, have their own specific format that they want your case submitted in. For example, one consulate may require your documentation presented in a certain order, and they may impose a page limit so that you can only submit, let's say, for example, 70 pages for your E2 submission. Another consulate may have a totally different order in which they want to see your documentation, and they may have no such page limit. So it's very interesting in the context of an E2 visa that the different consulates have their own processes, they have their own preference in how they want the documentation to be submitted to them. And so two consulates can have vastly different preferences in this regard. So I wanted to ask you, Cristina, can you share with us a success story of an E2 case that stands out to you? Maybe you would like to share about maybe the background of the case, the investment, the type of business. I'm sure our audience would really value hearing one of these success stories from you.
Of course, Michael. Yes, I have several, but particularly like this success story in light of what had happened to the client before he hired us. We worked together on this case. So one of my favorite E2 success stories involves a dual Brazilian and UK national who, despite having being refused entry to the United States on a prior occasion, and having two E2 visa denials in the consulate of Sao Paulo in Brazil, ultimately achieved success. The applicant approaches wanting to apply for an E2 visa in the US consulate in the UK. The treaty with the UK has an additional requirement aside of the E2 requirements we discussed earlier. It requires UK citizens to show ongoing residency in the UK when they apply for the Year 2 visa. In this case, the applicant, our client, had been living in the UK for a long time now. He was able to provide documentation to prove his ongoing residency. His children were in school, so transcripts. His wife was employed. He was also self-employed and was able to provide his taxes, lease agreements, and everything was in place. When he approached us, he wanted to invest in a cleaning-based company in the United States, and this time he opted out for a franchise model for its established success. In his prior E2 visa denials, he had a floor installation services company. He had invested a lot of funds, but unfortunately his visa had been denied. He filed with the help of prior counsel. And this time he really wanted to mitigate the potential for financial loss, given that he had already lost a significant amount of money when he applied for the E2 visa in the past. So in this case, he used an escrow agreement with a condition precedent clause that said 7 days after the E2 visa gets approved, the funds would go to the franchisor. And if the visa got denied, the funds would go back to him. It was interesting because usually for franchises and startups, we don't use a lot of escrow agreements. We usually use escrow agreements for clients that are purchasing an existing business. But in this case, we managed to show that he had made a substantial amount. So aside from putting in escrow funds relating to the franchise fee, we agreed that he would transfer funds to show both a commitment to the enterprise, that he would be ready to commence operations upon the approval of the visa. So he placed the franchise fee in escrow, 1 year worth of inventory, upfront advertising costs, software and technology fees, and he also prepaid royalty fees. So he put this amount in escrow, but aside of these funds being in escrow, he also made another at-risk investment. He secured business premises, which he paid up front. I believe it was 6 months up front of rent to store inventory, to be able to have a place where he would direct his business. He also paid attorney's fees. He had to hire attorney for due diligence to ensure they would read the franchise agreement, that would advise him properly. He also had to pay escrow fees, and all the fees amounted to, I think it was $110,000 that we could show that he had placed at risk. So luckily he attended his interview. He really knew why he wanted to invest in a franchise. He had researched the franchise. It had environmentally friendly products, and he really liked these and several other reasons, aside from being a well-established success franchise. So his visa was approved. Both he got it approved, his spouse, his children, now he's living here in the US running his business.
That is fascinating because typically escrow is a very compelling vehicle for prospective E2 investors because you have this escrow arrangement, and one of the big concerns for some E2 investors is, oh man, I have to go out and I have to go and make this investment, spend this money, and then if the case doesn't get approved for whatever reason, what do I do? Do I have to just now sell all the stuff that I just bought? Some of the stuff I can't sell. I just spent 3 months worth of a lease. So some people have that concern. So the remedy to that concern in some cases is escrow, because with escrow, like you mentioned earlier in this video, let's say there's a business for sale, you can approach the seller of that business and say, hey, look, I'm very interested in your business, but I want to close on this business only in the event that my E2 visa gets approved, because if my E2 visa doesn't get approved, I can't come here to operate it. So let's enter into an escrow agreement so that we'll just have this one contingency that the sale will close upon E2 approval. And that way, in the event that for whatever reason the E2 doesn't get approved, the funds for the purchase and sale of that business go back to the buyer, and they're not in that situation where they have this business that they can't come to the United States to operate. Now, what's fascinating about your case study is that typically I've seen escrow work in the context of a purchase and sale of an existing business. Let's say there's like a restaurant and the owner of that restaurant wants to sell the restaurant, and there's a buyer that wants to do the E2 visa. So that business is already in existence. The seller, let's say, has the business on the market for $100,000. So the buyer will transfer the $100,000 to the escrow account with the escrow agreement, and it will be typically done in the context of an existing business. But in this case, you're saying that the client successfully got their E2 approved based on a franchise investment where the franchise was not an already existing brick and mortar storefront. It was various segments of the funds were put in escrow in like a piecemeal fashion, like X amount of dollars for the franchise fee, X amount of dollars for royalties, and so on and so forth. And it ultimately was approved. Very fascinating. Thank you for sharing that.
One important aspect that I forgot to mention, it was that one of the requirements of the E2 visa is that the visa needs to be real and operating or at the brink of operations. My concern is that because you have all the funds in escrow and this is a franchise, that they would think, okay, yes, your investment is a risk. The only contingency in escrow is that your visa gets denied. If the visa gets approved, all the funds go to the franchisor. But that they would think that it's not at the brink of operations. So, but what we did was we also included a letter from the franchisor explaining that if the visa gets approved, because he has his lease, he has all the inventory, he had everything in place, he was ready to commence operations. He would just need to hire the staff and everything to commence. So I think that was also very important.
Absolutely. It's certainly worthy of exploring this case study because it's such an interesting example. Of course, I'm sure your preference and my preference is not to rely on that situation. And there's ways to structure a case that you can avoid putting it to the interpretation of an immigration officer that may not look at it as favorably. I think we both agree on that, but it's the approval was secured in a non-conventional way, and that's awesome. And I'm happy you shared that with us.
Yeah, and the
Lastly,
client was aware that this is a new, generally we don't do it for escrow for this type of businesses, but
yeah,
so
I recall. Yeah, I recall. We were. This was done with the full explanation of the risks involved to the client, but the client wanted to proceed nonetheless. And fortunately, it resulted in an approval. I wanted to close off this video with just asking you about any alternatives. Some people might be watching this video, and I'm sure many are watching and saying, you know what, E2 is phenomenal. I love E2. I want to go forward with E2. And some people might be saying, you know what, I'm not from a treaty country, or I don't have the funds to invest, or it could be any number of scenarios. But what would you say are some alternatives to E2?
alternatives to E2 for people who want to live and work in the United States. There are various non-immigrant visas and also immigrant visas that are available, but each one obviously, like the E2, have their own specific requirements and circumstances depend on the individual applicant. I think starting with an EB5 immigrant investor program. This program grants permanent residencies to foreign investors who make a significant capital investment in a new commercial enterprise that creates a lot of jobs. Also, L1A intra-company transferee visas. These visas are designed for multinational companies who want to transfer executive managers or specialized knowledge employees to an affiliate or subsidiary company in the US. Important requirement is that the employee has to be working for at least 1 year in the foreign company in one of the executive, managerial, or specialized knowledge capacity. This is a very general overview, right? But as we know, they have very strict requirements and you would have to comply, but generally. H-1B specialty occupation visas. These are for individuals with specialized knowledge who hold a bachelor's degree or equivalent in work experience and who have a job offer here in the United States. So for this visa, you need sponsorship from a U.S. employer, as well as the L1A. O1 visa for individuals of extraordinary ability, designed for individuals who have extraordinary ability in the arts, sciences, business, athletics, education. You have to show a high level of expertise and meet certain eligibility criteria. EB1 extraordinary ability, in this case, similar to the O1, but it's a path for the green card. You also have to show extraordinary ability in one of those fields: arts, education, businesses, athletics, sciences. But most importantly, you need to show that you have sustained national or international acclaim in order to apply. The TN visa for citizens of Canada or Mexico. These are applicants in certain occupations can come work for a U.S. employer for a temporary basis. And the E1 treaty trader investor visa that has similar requirements to the E2 visa, but is based for individuals involved in substantial trade between the US company and the foreign country. So those are just some general visas that can allow you to come to the United States and work in the United States.
There you have it. We covered a lot of ground in this video. If you are watching this video and you branch off of some of the things we talked about, feel free to put them in the comments. If there's something that wasn't covered in this video that you have questions about, again, feel free to put them in the comments. We review the comments regularly. Cristina, it was an absolute pleasure having you on this video, and I hope that we can have you back. We can discuss some other topics or explore other aspects of the E2 visa or other visas, and I'm sure our audience tremendously benefited. To our viewers, thank you so much for tuning in, and as always, I will see you on the next video. Thank you.
Thank you.